Greenshaw'S Folly loomed against the blood-red evening sky, a monstrous silhouette of jagged turrets and crumbling grandeur. It wasn't just a house, it was a warning, a place where secrets festered and shadows whispered stories of betrayal and death. The story begins with a haunting view of Greenshaw'S Folly, a mansion so peculiar that it defies description. Its towering turrets pierce the sky like accusing fingers, while ivy creeps over its crumbling stone walls, as though nature herself is trying to bury its secrets. The house stands apart from the modern world, a relic of another time at once grand and grotesque, beautiful and eerie. The air around it carries a strange stillness, broken only by the faint creak of ancient weather vanes turning in the wind. To anyone passing by, it's clear that this isn't just a house. It's a keeper of stories, of whispers, of lies. Miss Greenshaw, the reclusive matriarch of the estate, is just as enigmatic as her home. A tall, stern woman with sharp eyes that seem to miss nothing, she prowls the halls of her mansion like a queen guarding her kingdom. Her every movement carries a sense of purpose, as if she's constantly watching, listening for what, no one knows. She lives alone, surrounded only by her loyal but nervous housekeeper, Mrs. Cresswell, and a stoic gardener named Alfred. Miss Greenshaw's presence commands respect, but it's her words that linger in the minds of those who visit her. She has a way of speaking in riddles, as if she's playing a game only she knows the rules to. Recently, rumors have begun to swirl in the nearby village. They say Miss Greenshaw has been working on a new will document that could change the fate of her sprawling estate forever. But why now? And why is she so secretive about it? The whispers grow louder when Miss Marple, the ever-curious amateur detective, is invited for tea at Greenshaw'S Folly. The two women sit in the grand but decaying drawing room, where heavy curtains block out most of the sunlight. Dust motes dance in the dim light, giving the space an almost otherworldly glow. As they chat, Miss Greenshaw's words grow increasingly cryptic. She looks around the room, her gaze lingering on the faded portraits of long-dead ancestors that line the walls. Her fingers trace the edge of her teacup, as if she's lost in thought. "This house has outlived so many," she says softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father, my brothers, even the ones who tried to take it from me. And yet, it keeps its secrets. Sometimes, I wonder if I'll live long enough to see them revealed." Miss Marple raises an eyebrow, intrigued by the odd comment. But before she can respond, Miss Greenshaw leans forward. Her sharp eyes meet Miss Marple's, and for the first time there's a flicker of fear behind them. "But mark my words," Miss Greenshaw says, her voice dropping to a near growl. "This house will outlive us all. The question is, will I live to see what's coming?" The room falls silent, and a sudden gust of wind rattles the windows, as if the house itself is answering her. Miss Marple feels a chill creep down her spine. What secret could Greenshaw'S Folly be hiding, and why does its mistress seem so certain of danger? As the clock strikes an ominous chime in the distance, Miss Marple knows one thing for sure. This is no ordinary house, and Miss Greenshaw's words are no idle musings. Something is coming, something dark, something dangerous, and Greenshaw'S Folly is at the heart of it all. Cliffhanger. Miss Greenshaw stands abruptly, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "I need to check something," she murmurs, almost to herself. As she leaves the room, she turns back for a moment and adds, "If anything happens to me, remember this house, it knows everything." The door closes behind her, leaving Miss Marple alone in the shadowy room, her mind racing. Seconds later, a loud crash echoes through the house. Asterisk, asterisk, 2. The arrival of conflict, the gathering storm. The morning air at Greenshaw'S Folly is heavy, almost suffocating, as a parade of relatives begins to arrive. One by one, their cars crunch up the gravel driveway, each vehicle more extravagant than the last, as if they're competing to prove their worth. Inside, the cavernous entrance hall feels smaller with every new arrival. Polite smiles and feigned affection fill the space, but beneath the surface, the tension is palpable, simmering like a kettle about to boil. First comes Charles, the eldest nephew, a smug businessman with a reputation for cutting corners in people alike. He strides in with a forced laugh, kissing Miss Greenshaw's hand as if he actually cares for her well-being. Behind him, his wife Daphne clutches her pearl necklace with one hand and her husband's arm with the other, her eyes darting around the mansion like a vulture sizing up its prey. Next is Caroline, the elegant but sharp-tongued niece whose quiet presence masks a razor-sharp ambition. She lingers near the grand staircase, letting her fingers brush against the banister. Such fine craftsmanship. She murmurs to no one in particular, though the gleam in her eye says she's already mentally appraising the property. Then there's Reginald, the youngest and most unassuming of the group, or so he'd like them to believe. With his rumpled coat and hesitant demeanor, he blends into the background, but his quick glances at the others betray a keen awareness. He isn't here to lose. Miss Greenshaw greets them all with the same air of detached amusement, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "How lovely to see you all," she says, her voice dripping with sarcasm. And such impeccable timing, too. As the relatives settle into the drawing room, the real games begin. Polite conversation dances around the true topic of interest, the rumored new will. Each relative tries to extract information without appearing too eager, their words laced with hidden barbs. But Miss Greenshaw, ever the chess master, gives nothing away. She merely sits back in her ornate armchair, watching them squirm like fish on a hook. Meanwhile, MissMarple observes from the sidelines, her sharp mind catching every nuance. It isn't just the relatives who seem on edge, there's something odd about the household staff. Mrs. Cresswell, the housekeeper, moves about the room with an air of nervous energy, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she pours tea. She avoids eye contact with everyone, except the gardener, Alfred. Alfred stands by the window, his back straight and his expression unreadable. He's a tall, imposing figure, but there's something in the way he holds himself attention that suggests he's hiding something. MissMarple notices the subtle glances exchanged between Mrs. Cresswell and Alfred, the way her gaze lingers on him a second too long, and the way he seems to stiffen under her watchful eyes. It's as if the two of them share a secret tone that neither dares to speak aloud. The tension in the room reaches its peak when Miss Greenshaw finally breaks the silence. "Well," she says with a sly smile, "I do hope you're all comfortable. It's been quite some time since this house has hosted such spirited company." Before anyone can respond, the grandfather clock in the corner strikes sharply, its chime echoing through the room like a warning. Miss Greenshaw rises from her chair, her eyes flicking to each of her guests. "I'll leave you to your little reunion," she says, her tone dripping with irony. "I have some business to attend to." Cliffhanger. Asterisk, asterisk. As she leaves the room, Mrs. Cresswell follows her with a look of barely concealed panic. MissMarple catches sight of something strange, a small, folded note tucked into the pocket of Mrs. Cresswell's apron. Moments later, a loud crash echoes from upstairs, followed by a muffled scream. The hidden will. The game changes. As the afternoon sun dips behind the jagged turrets of Greenshaw'S Folly, the atmosphere inside the mansion turns electric. Over tea in the grand but dilapidated drawing room, Miss Greenshaw, seated in her high-backed chair like a queen on her throne, finally drops the bombshell. "I've taken the liberty of drafting a new will," she announces, her voice sharp enough to cut through the feigned civility of her assembled relatives. The room falls silent, as if the very walls are holding their breath. Her nephews and nieces exchange quick, darting glances, the kind that speak volumes without a single word. Charles, the ever-calculating businessman, leans forward slightly, his knuckles whitening against the armrest of his chair. Caroline, cool and composed, takes a deliberate sip of her tea, though the tremor in her hand doesn't escape MissMarple's sharp eyes. Reginald, sitting awkwardly in the corner, manages a weak cough, as if to break the unbearable silence. Miss Greenshaw smirks, clearly enjoying their discomfort. "Of course," she continues, "I won't bore you with the details of the document. Suffice it to say, I've made some adjustments. Life is full of surprises, isn't it?" "Adjustments," Charles echoes, his voice a little too loud, a little too strained. "Aunt Edith, Surely you don't mean. Oh, but I do. She cuts him off sharply, her eyes gleaming with mischief or malice. One must reward loyalty, after all. The tension in the room is now a tangible thing, heavy and oppressive. Caroline sets down her teacup with a quiet clink, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're teasing us, Aunt Edith," she says smoothly, though her eyes betray her growing anxiety. Surely there's no need for such dramatics. Miss Greenshaw chuckles, a dry, brittle sound. "My dear, life is nothing without a little drama." She rises from her chair with surprising ease for a woman her age, her long shadow stretching across the faded Persian rug. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I've said enough for one day." As she leaves the room, her footsteps echo through the cavernous halls, leaving behind a silence that feels deafening. The relatives erupt into whispers the moment she's out of earshot. Accusations and theories fly, each more venomous than the last. MissMarple sits quietly, knitting in the corner, but her sharp mind is already piecing together the puzzle. That night, Greenshaw'S Folly takes on an entirely different character. Beneath the silver light of the moon, the mansion seems almost alive, its creaking timbers and groaning pipes filling the dark corridors with an eerie symphony. MissMarple, ever the night owl, sits by her window, her hands resting lightly on her lap as she gazes out at the shadowy gardens. Suddenly, a faint sound catches her ear. Raised voices. She leans forward, straining to make out the source of the commotion. The voices are coming from the study, Miss Greenshaw's study. One voice is unmistakably hers, sharp and commanding, but the other is low and furious, barely more than a growl. "You've gone too far this time," the second voice hisses. MissMarple's brow furrows. A man, one of the relatives, or someone else entirely. "You won't scare me," Miss Greenshaw snaps, her voice trembling with anger. "This house has stood for 100 years, and so have I." The argument crescendos into a crash, a loud, splintering sound that reverberates through the halls. MissMarple rises swiftly, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabs her shawl and moves toward the study, her slippers whispering against the cold stone floors. When she reaches the door, the room is deathly silent. Slowly, she pushes it open, the heavy wood creaking ominously. The study is empty, or so it seems at first glance. Papers are scattered across the desk, a vase lies shattered on the floor, and the curtains billow slightly in the breeze from an open window. MissMarple steps inside cautiously, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. Then she notices a faint metallic smell hanging in the air. Blood? No, not quite. Her mind races as she leans closer to the desk, where a single damp handprint mars the polished surface. "This," she murmurs to herself, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart, "is no accident." Cliffhanger. Asterisk, asterisk. From somewhere deep within the house, a low creak echoes, a sound too deliberate to be the settling of old wood. MissMarple freezes, her pulse quickening. She turns toward the sound, the darkness of the corridor swallowing the faint light spilling from the study. Someone is still there. The shocking incident. Death comes calling. The morning dawns heavy and gray, the skies above Greenshaw'S Folly mirroring the growing unease within its walls. The once echoing mansion now seems eerily silent, as though it knows what's about to be discovered. It's the housekeeper, Mrs. Cresswell, who finds her first. A scream cuts through the stillness, sharp and chilling, drawing the rest of the household to the study like moths to a grim flame. There, slumped over her grand oak desk, is Miss Greenshaw. Her usually defiant figure now looks strangely small, her head resting on a stack of papers as though she had simply fallen asleep mid-thought. But the ashen pallor of her face and the unnatural stillness of her body speak otherwise. In one hand, stiff and unmoving, she clutches a crumpled piece of paper. Chaos erupts. "What is this madness?" Charles shouts, his voice trembling as he stares at his lifeless aunt. Caroline presses a lace handkerchief to her mouth, her face pale, but her sharp eyes darting around the room. Reginald stumbles backward, nearly tripping over a fallen chair. Mrs. Cresswell, her hands shaking violently, clutches the edge of the desk as she cries. She must have passed peacefully in her sleep. Poor thing. It's her heart. I'm sure of it. Peacefully, Caroline's voice slices through the air like a knife. Does this look peaceful to you? She points to the crumpled note still trapped in Miss Greenshaw's lifeless fingers. What does it say? Charles leans over, prying the paper loose with shaking hands. As he reads aloud, his voice drops to a whisper, the weight of the words filling the room. It wasn't meant for me. The room falls into stunned silence. The note is passed from hand to hand, each relative examining it as though it might explain the unexplainable. Amid the chaos, Miss Marple remains quietly composed, her keen eyes sweeping the room. Her gaze lingers on the open window, the faint trace of smudges on the sill. Then, she notices something else. An empty teacup, tipped over on the floor, its contents staining the edge of the rug like an ominous shadow. Poison, she murmurs under her breath, crouching to examine the cup more closely. The faintest scent of almonds wafts up to meet her, unmistakable and deadly. Her fingers brush against the base of the desk, where she finds a tiny shard of glass, jagged and gleaming. This wasn't a natural death, she mutters, her voice low but firm. No one dies so neatly. Her words hang in the air, almost swallowed by the oppressive silence. She stands, her sharp mind racing through the possibilities. Behind her, the relatives are still bickering, their accusations rising in pitch and volume. Cliffhanger. Asterisk, asterisk. Just as Miss Marple straightens, the grandfather clock in the corner chimes loudly, its booming tones startling everyone into silence. In that moment, a quiet sound drifts from the hollow soft creak, like a footstep on an old floorboard. She turns sharply toward the doorway, her pulse quickening. Someone had been listening, someone who now slips away into the shadows of Greenshaw'S Folly. Miss Marple's investigation begins, unmasking the shadows. The death of Miss Greenshaw hangs over the mansion like a storm cloud, thickening the air with tension and suspicion. The once bickering relatives have grown quieter now, their gazes shifting warily from one another. But Miss Marple, with her unassuming demeanor and sharp eyes, is already at work, unraveling the first threads of a tangled web. The smudged teacup. The first thing that catches her attention is the teacup, the same one she noticed overturned near Miss Greenshaw's desk. Upon closer inspection, she notices a faint smudge on its rim, as though someone had handled it with gloves or wiped it hurriedly. The smell of almonds lingers faintly, confirming her earlier suspicions. Cyanide, she murmurs to herself, glancing at the small circle of tea left at the bottom of the cup, a classic choice for someone who doesn't want to struggle. She wonders who served Miss Greenshaw her tea. Was it Mrs. Cresswell, with her trembling hands and nervous disposition? Or perhaps Alfred, the silent and stoic gardener, who seemed oddly composed amid the chaos? The missing fountain pen. While others argue over the crumpled note found in Miss Greenshaw's hand, Miss Marple's attention turns to the desk. The papers on its surface are scattered, but something feels incomplete. Her eyes flit across the desk until she notices a small indentation on the blotter, a groove that could only have been made by a fountain pen pressing down. Strange, she mutters. Where is it now? The missing pen raises an intriguing question. Could it be connected to the mysterious new will Miss Greenshaw had so tantalizingly mentioned? Had someone stolen it to ensure the will was never signed, or perhaps to forge it later? The gardener's strange movements. Outside, the gardener, Alfred, works in the overgrown garden with a calm that feels almost deliberate. Miss Marple watches him from the window, noting how he avoids the other staff and family members. His eyes dart toward the mansion now and then, as if watching for something or someone. During her casual questioning of the housekeeper, Mrs. Cresswell, Miss Marple learns that Alfred had been outside the study window at the exact time of Miss Greenshaw's death. Just pruning the hedges, he says, Mrs. Cresswell adds, her voice tinged with doubt. But he doesn't usually work that corner of the garden this time of day. Miss Marple files the information away. A gardener pruning hedges near the study window, just as a death occurs. The timing feels too coincidental to ignore. The torn fabric. As dusk falls, Miss Marple takes a quiet walk around the mansion, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. Near the study's open window, something catches her eye, a small, torn piece of fabric snagged on a nail, protruding from the window frame. She picks it up, feeling the material between her fingers. It's expensive, perhaps part of a jacket or a dress sleeve, and its color-deep navy blue matches none of the clothes worn by the household staff that day. The positioning of the fabric tells her more than words ever could. Someone had tried to leave through the window, in a rush so great they hadn't noticed their clothing tearing. The faint footprints in the soft earth below confirm it. Someone had been here. Miss Marple straightens, her gaze narrowing as she holds the torn fabric in the fading light. Cliffhanger, asterisk, asterisk. Who was in such a hurry to leave unnoticed? She whispers to herself, the edges of her lips tightening in determination. But as she tucks the fabric into her pocket, a chill runs down her spine. From the shadowed tree line beyond the garden, she feels the unmistakable sensation of being watched. When she turns, the dark figure of someone lurking disappears into the woods, leaving Miss Marple alone with her suspicions and the knowledge that the killer might already know she's onto them. The hidden truth unfolds. Miss Marple moved through the grand estate with quiet determination, her sharp eyes missing nothing. As she spent more time with the family and staff, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The dark secrets that lay buried beneath the polished exterior of this family were far from simple. Her first discovery was a chilling one. Charles, the eldest nephew, was in financial ruin. His debts were staggering. And though he had been living comfortably off the family fortune for years, his lavish lifestyle was quickly becoming untenable. As Miss Marple delved deeper, she learned that his inheritance would clear those debts and leave him with far more than anyone else in the family. It was the perfect motive for murder, wrapped in the guise of family loyalty. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the man, watching him with a knowing eye. What lengths would someone go to for the promise of a fresh start? But it wasn't just Charles who had something to hide. Miss Marple turned her attention to the housekeeper, a woman who had been with the family for decades, yet seemed more agitated than usual. Her normally calm demeanor was replaced by nervous glances and trembling hands. Something was off, something that didn't fit with her long history of unshakable professionalism. Miss Marple had already suspected the housekeeper's involvement in the strange events surrounding the new will, which had appeared under mysterious circumstances. Now she could feel the tension in the air like an electric charge, ready to snap. The housekeeper had been hiding more than just her fear. She was hiding her complicity in the crime. But it was the gardener who caught Miss Marple's attention most. Quiet and reserved, he had always been an enigmatic figure in the household. His life seemed to be an open book, yet Miss Marple could sense something else, something unsaid. Late into the night, Miss Marple watched him through the window of the drawing room, his gaze fixed and distant. It was then that she realized the truth. He had seen something. Something he knew. Something he feared. Fear, however, had kept him silent. Miss Marple had no doubt that the gardener was withholding vital information, though he lacked the courage to speak. What had he witnessed in the shadows that night? With each of these revelations, the puzzle grew darker, and Miss Marple's mind whirred with possibilities. But there was one thing left to investigate: the gardener's shed. Something about the place had always seemed off to Miss Marple. No one had dared to approach it for days. When she finally slipped inside, she found what she was looking for hidden deep within a wooden crate, tucked away from view. A small vial, almost invisible in the dim light. Its contents were unmistakable. A faint, acrid scent clung to the glass. Poison. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she held the vial in her hands. Poison always leaves a trace, she murmured softly, her voice barely a whisper. Her fingers tightened around the vial, and her mind raced. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place, but one question remained. Whose hands had placed it there? Whose were the guilty hands that had mixed the poison, planning the death that had shaken this family to its core? She closed her eyes for a moment, her sharp mind calculating the next move. But in that split second of silence, she heard something faint, a creak in the floorboard behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping. The gardener stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. The room felt colder, as his voice barely escaped his lips. "You've found it, haven't you, Miss Marple?" With a small, knowing smile, Miss Marple nodded, but her gaze was unwavering, steady. The game had just begun. Cliffhanger, asterisk, asterisk. As the gardener took a hesitant step forward, the air in the shed grew thick with tension. Miss Marple's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Poison always leaves a trace, but whose hands does it lead back to?" The gardener recoiled, as if the words themselves had struck him, his face contorting in terror. Before he could answer, the door slammed shut behind him, locking them both in. Outside, a shadow lingered, unseen, waiting for the next move. Miss Marple's heart raced. The final piece was in motion. Who would be the next to fall? The climactic revelation. The grand drawing room was thick with anticipation. The evening light barely filtered through the drawn curtains, casting long shadows over the faces of the gathered family and staff. Each of them had been summoned, one by one, to stand before Miss Marple, whose quiet resolve had grown with each passing hour of investigation. There was nowhere left to run, no more lies to tell. The truth, as it always does, was about to surface. Miss Marple stood at the center of the room, a figure of calm amid the storm of suspicion. The suspects: Charles, the arrogant nephew; the quiet and fearful Alfred, the gardener; Margaret, the niece who had been conspicuously absent from most of the day's events; and Mrs. Cresswell, the ever-dutiful housekeeper, watched her with a mix of uncertainty and dread. They knew the end was near, but they didn't know just how much of the story they had misunderstood. Miss Marple spoke first, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "I have gathered you all here to unearth the truth, and the truth is far more complicated than any of you might have anticipated." She paused, her gaze flicking over Mrs. Cresswell with an almost imperceptible shift. "The murderer is among us. The person responsible for Miss Greenshaw's death is none other than Mrs. Cresswell, the housekeeper." A collective gasp filled the room. Mrs. Cresswell, who had been standing with her head slightly bowed, trembled. Her fingers twitched at her sides, but she did not speak. Miss Marple's eyes never left her. "You see," Miss Marple continued, her voice steady, "Mrs. Cresswell, who had been devoted to Miss Greenshaw for many years, found herself in a difficult position when one of the relatives approached her with an offer. Together they forged a new will-o-will that favored this relative and left the others in the cold. But when Miss Greenshaw, ever vigilant, discovered the forgery, she confronted Mrs. Cresswell. A confrontation that sent Mrs. Cresswell into a panic. The room shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Cresswell's face drained of color. It was all true. She had done it. Her breaths were shallow now, and she looked as though she might collapse at any moment. It was in the moments after Miss Greenshaw uncovered the truth, Miss Marple pressed on, that Mrs. Cresswell made a fateful decision. She poisoned Miss Greenshaw's tea, knowing that it would be too late for anyone to stop it once the poison had taken hold. The housekeeper looked down, as though she were unable to face the eyes of those around her. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but his eyes stayed locked on Mrs. Cresswell, a flicker of satisfaction in them. He had hoped it would be her all along. "But there's more," Miss Marple said, raising a hand to quell the murmurs of disbelief. Alfred, the gardener, was not as silent as he seemed. Though terrified of implicating himself, he tried to leave subtle clues that would, if pieced together, expose Mrs. Cresswell's role in this tragedy. The gardener, who had been standing near the back, looked as though he might faint. His eyes darted nervously from Miss Marple to the others, guilt and fear plainly written on his face. He had tried. He had left the marks, the moments when he had hesitated to speak, the broken pieces of evidence that didn't seem to fit. Now it was clear. He had tried to warn them all. Unfortunately, Miss Marple concluded, his subtle attempts were not enough. The poison took hold too quickly, and Miss Greenshaw was lost before anyone could uncover the full truth. The room was silent, but it was a silence filled with tension. The pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit except for one. Miss Marple stepped forward, looking each person in the eye before she added, "But there is one final detail that I must reveal to you all." The room held its breath. Miss Greenshaw did indeed change her mind about the will, Miss Marple said. She decided, in the end, to rewrite it, to ensure the family was protected in the way she always intended, with no one left in need. But the new will is now missing. Gasps echoed throughout the room as the weight of the revelation sank in. The will had been genuine. Miss Greenshaw had intended to change it, but the question remained who had taken it. Miss Marple turned her sharp gaze to the family, then to Alfred and Mrs. Cresswell. You see, it is not just the murder that we must solve now. We are faced with a more urgent mystery. The real will is out there, and the question is, who has it? The air grew thick with suspicion as eyes shifted nervously. Someone in this room was hiding something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Cliffhanger. Just as Miss Marple turned to leave, her words lingering in the air, a faint sound echoed through the house like a door creaking open, followed by a soft thud. A figure stood silhouetted against the faint light from the hallway. Miss Marple stopped in her tracks, a knowing smile curling on her lips. "There you are," she whispered. The mystery was far from over. The haunting conclusion. The grand clock in the entrance hall of Greenshaw'S Folly chimed its final toll, signaling the end of a long and turbulent chapter. The mansion, once a home filled with laughter and life, now stood in solemn quiet, its walls heavy with the weight of secrets and betrayal. The rightful heirs, the distant cousins who had been unaware of their inheritance until the final twist of fate had arrived, their faces marked by the trials they had endured to reclaim their birthright. But even as they stepped into the house that had once belonged to their ancestors, it was clear that the mansion had changed them. The gleaming front door now seemed like a gateway to something far darker than they had anticipated. As they moved through the rooms, the echoes of past lives seemed to linger in the air, settling into the worn floorboards and ancient tapestries. The family matriarch, Miss Greenshaw, was gone, her legacy now forever entwined with the treachery that had unfolded within these walls. The inheritance, once a symbol of prosperity, now seemed like a heavy burden that none of them were truly ready to bear. The heirs paused in the grand drawing room, standing around the spot where Miss Greenshaw had spent her final moments. The room was a chilling reminder of the price that had been paid for the secrets buried within this house. The grand fireplace, now cold and dark, once had been a hearth of warmth. Now it seemed to guard only memories of treachery and despair. As the last of the family left the room, heads heavy with reflection, Miss Marple stood alone by the window, her figure barely visible in the fading light. Her sharp eyes took in the scene before her, a sense of finality settling in her bones. The case was closed, but the house, she knew, would never truly be at peace. "The house," Miss Marple said softly to herself, almost as though the mansion itself were listening, "keeps its secrets longer than its people." Her words lingered in the stillness, and with a final glance at the towering, ivy-clad walls of Greenshaw'S Folly, Miss Marple turned away, her purpose fulfilled. But there was no satisfaction in her departure, only the weight of a mystery that had unraveled but left behind more questions than answers. As the car rumbled down the gravel driveway, Miss Marple's mind turned to something else: the house. It would remain a place of whispers, of things unsaid, and of dark memories. But even she knew that some things could never be fully understood. But in the final moments, as the sun set and cast long, ghostly shadows over the estate, the real mystery was just beginning to unfold. Final cliffhanger. Alfred, the quiet gardener who had always seemed to be more a part of the house than any of its inhabitants, lingered outside in the overgrown garden. His weathered hands worked deftly, turning the soil with a careful precision that only someone who had spent decades tending this land could possess. His spade hit something hard, something that didn't belong in the earth. A soft thud echoed through the still air. He knelt down, brushing the soil aside with a mixture of disbelief and familiarity. There, half buried in the dirt, was a sealed envelope. Its edges were worn, as though it had been buried for years, hidden away from prying eyes. Alfred's fingers curled around the envelope, pulling it from the ground with a smug, almost wicked grin. His eyes, once dull and cautious, now gleamed with a quiet satisfaction. With the envelope clutched tightly in his hand, he whispered to the wind, This should have stayed buried. He stood up, his posture rigid as he stared at the envelope for a moment longer, then glanced over his shoulder as if ensuring no one was watching. The sky darkened, the air growing colder with every passing second, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. As Alfred smirked to himself, turning away to retreat into the shadows of the garden, the screen faded to black. The questions hung in the air like a dense fog. What was in the envelope? Who had hidden it, and why? The mystery of Greenshaw'S Folly wasn't over. It was only just beginning.